Dan Johnson is our next presentation on grasshoppers. He's with the University of Lethbridge. He's committed to research and public understanding of science. He has a very active Twitter account, and he does lots of work as far as promoting awareness of bugs and such. And also, I think maybe a little bit of woodworking in his spare time. But nonetheless, I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to get you on screen to talk about grasshoppers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I guess the bio I sent should have just said likes bugs, talks a lot, because that would pretty well cover it. Should I share my screen right away maybe and begin?
Absolutely.
What I have.
There you go.
I was talking to several of you and also to John Gavlowski, and I was told some of the things people might like to hear. So what I've done is I've interspersed some of the pest versus non-pest biodiversity photos with a little bit of data and history and advice. Tried to make it interesting, but I can't cover all, of course, and I won't try, but there's a lot of photos of insects and I'll flip through them fairly quickly. So don't be confused. If your take-home message is just that this is a group that has a lot of diversity, that's half the battle. That's good. So I'm mixing it up. I entitled it Weather, Grasshopper Diversity, Outbreaks, Natural Controls, and Future Management. And I'll try to pack that in. However, I think I better watch my time.
I'll do that for you, Dan. You just go.
Will you tell me when I have maybe 5 or 10 minutes left?
5-minute warning. You got it.
Okay. John and others recommended these topics: weather, natural controls, identifying species, estimating population levels, what works, what doesn't, what's needed, what isn't, and then a little bit about control methods and possible future considerations. So I'll flip through this fairly quickly. So right now, if you live in Manitoba, you know that the two-striped grasshopper in the upper left is quite a significant pest and has been slowly growing, particularly in the southwest. But some of these others are worth watching for. The clear-winged on the lower right, I'll talk about later, is a grass feeder. The other 4 here are mixed feeders. They'll eat almost anything. This one in the lower left is on my radar for a decade, and only in the past few years has it shot up in numbers, wiping out alfalfa and canola in Alberta and BC, and I suspect soon in Saskatchewan, Manitoba as well. I just thought I'd make a plug for a little freebie you might like to have. It still has 6 weeks of life left in it. If you Google me or go to the University of Lethbridge website, you can get a grasshopper calendar. You can download it, pass it around, give it for Christmas to your socially distanced friends, and enjoy. So this is a two-striped grasshopper. You can recognize it by its sort of large size. This is a female. That abdomen is growing eggs right now. There are 2 stripes on the back. That saddle on it is the pronotum, the top front portion of the thorax, but the 2 lines run all the way to the back and join. So that's the two-striped grasshopper. It's very, very common and a big eater. When it first hatches, it looks very tiny, 1/8 inch long, covered with dots. Nothing special except the leg is very clearly from the same beast. A little older, still got that line on the leg, starting to form wing buds. These little wing buds eventually become little triangles and move into a larger grasshopper that's ready to obtain wings. Now, during this stage, the Manitoba government website rightly says that you should aim to control them in the 3rd and 4th. That one in the very middle, the green ones, is a 3rd. They tend to move along these lines into crops, and they follow that line as they run out of food. You can see from the trail here, from the tracks, somebody's been spraying, apparently to no avail. And this is typically what can happen from the edge, and that's why edge treatment and strip treatment sometimes is quite effective. You don't have to treat whole fields. Unfortunately, they can be the same species but 2 different colors, but always look for the 2 stripes, even in the immature. So you're instant expert if you watch for those two stripes. Very thick stripes on this. This is the 5th stage, ready to become an adult. They have 5 immatures. And unfortunately here, the magenta and green, that's the same species, same field. It sheds its skin, it's slipping out of it here, and then pumps those wings full of blood, and away you go. And they're not particularly good flyers, like some of the other grasshoppers certainly are. But it's partly because of this large body size. Insects are called teneral when they're in this soft, light-colored stage. Same species. Eventually they breed. You can compare that to the immature, which is green. It's the same thing, but it's got the 2 stripes, right? And I can't stop taking pictures of grasshoppers. So here's another angle of it that shows a very dark looking 2-striped. It's the same animal. And even sometimes yellow. It's the same animal. They have geographic variation, they have genetic variation, but they have the same life cycle throughout the prairies. If you wanted to sample to find out what you have, that's a very good idea, because quite often in roadsides, it's just katydids or slant-faced grasshoppers singing away. Anything that sings is not a problem, but this net is almost entirely 2-striped grasshoppers. And when you do sample, there's no time for that here, but walk along quickly and swing it in kind of J strokes like that and hit the top of the vegetation. It's not really quantitative. It just tells you whether you have a lot or a little. Here's what the eggs look like. They look like brown rice. And they look the same in this similar looking species, Picardii. This is a Packard's grasshopper, which will be on the way up in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. It already is in Alberta, a little bit sandier soil, and they get going quickly. Packard's is recognized by these little dots on the back. The one on the top is a 2-stripe. The one on the bottom just has the dots. That's Packard's. But they're both pests, We'll come to some non-pests pretty quickly here. Here are the adults side by side. I actually placed them on a tree so that I could take a photo. This is a 2-striped on the left, Packard's on the right, a little bit more diffuse. You can see how it could be confused. If you more or less count them together, you could always email me or someone else, John or somebody, a photo. We'll tell you what it is. Okay, this is a famous lesser migratory grasshopper, probably the most famous pest in Canada. They flew in from the US in the 30s by the millions and millions. They bred, continued for years, but we do have our homegrown population. It sometimes has a purple top. It's the same animal. That's a gene that occurs in many species, actually. And it feeds on a wide range of plants, grass and forage. But you see these black dots that look like little squares, like a airplane window down the side. That's typical of the lesser migratory grasshopper. Probably the number 3 pest. Now, just a little bit of history here to break up the biology. Norman Criddle has been called the dean of early Western Canadian entomologists. He did a lot of things. He really worked out the pest and non-pest diversity of grasshoppers, and he collected the last Rocky Mountain locust in Treesbank, Manitoba in 1903. And what is that? Well, that's the greatest mystery other than the passenger pigeon in the science of extinction. They were actually in the trillions, no exaggeration at all. If you've read Little House on the Prairie, the eating of the clothing off the line and the shovel handles, that really happened. Something like 250,000 cattle died from starvation in a single summer because of these things. Families were eaten out. Many of the US states have historical things called grasshopper constitutions. No one knows why until you look back in the history, and it's because in order to get federal funding, they had to organize against the grasshopper outbreaks in the 1800s and form a constitution. Amazing, isn't it? Anyway, don't read this, but I threw it in here just to show that Manitoba was the heart of a lot of the Rocky Mountain locust activity. Lord Selkirk's colony was totally invaded. They filled Lake Winnipeg shoreline so deep that they couldn't walk the horses in to drink. Millions and millions and millions. By the time they got to Calgary, they ate the canvas tents of F Troop of the Northwest Mounted Police. Okay, a little bit more of Manitoba history here. This is how they used to control them. These are wagons pulling barrels full of arsenic that spread onto the field. This is a map of Manitoba problems in 1933 when they were putting on literally thousands and thousands of bushels of arsenic bait. Not unlike the current map. If you go to the Government of Manitoba website, you can see that it's roughly the same concentration. That arsenic's probably still out there. This is how they mixed it in Manitoba. Arsenic plus either bran or horse manure or various things to mix together. And this is the worst job in the province, standing there all day pouring poison into this flapper, putting it out on the field with questionable efficacy. This is an old lantern slide I found in a pile of boxes that were actually going in a dumpster once long ago, so I rescued that. This is a step up, not much, but a little. Auto trailer, they called it. They would actually take an old Model T or other car and stick the axle straight up, differential there at the bottom, and put a barrel on top and a flapper. You can find these in old ditches and farmyards even now. I'm not recommending them though. Just to give you a glimpse of the past, this is tons of poison bait spread in Saskatchewan. I don't have data for Manitoba. I wish I did. Look at that graph. 20,000 tons of arsenic bait. It's out of this world. In fact, they used to use cyanide too. And I once found a letter from American Cyanamid to a prairie entomologist saying, I'm sorry, our cyanide product did not control your cutworms, but we recommend 100 pounds per acre of cyanide. And okay, this is maybe also one of the worst jobs at the time, but hot, poisonous work. Now, in the 80s, we upgraded that. We first developed a 7XLR carbaryl bait at the Lethbridge Research Station. That's a much younger me standing at a big mixer. And we blew it out with a truck, put it on with airplanes. You know the whole story. There's EcoBran and other products out there that actually work quite well. And they work particularly well against this other pest that's happening in Manitoba right now. By the way, all these photos are mine, so none of them have attributions. But if anybody ever wants to have photos of insects for the benefit of agronomy or public good, I'm happy to provide them to you free. That's the Clearwing Grasshopper. I'll come back to that. Another one in Manitoba that's increasing, but perhaps not a problem, is the red-legged grasshopper. It is a problem out east, and it occurs in this blue form. And I'm taking the opportunity to throw it in there in case you ever see a blue one. You should email or call me because I'd love to hear about it. It's very rare, and we have a feeling that under warming conditions, it might become a little more common. Isn't that amazing? That's an amazing looking species. Okay, now we have a CAP program on a new problem called the Brunners Grasshopper, and it's a huge problem in BC and northern Alberta, and I suspect not moving, but increasing in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I'd like to come out and have a look. This one is a similar look-alike, but it's not a problem. Very short wings, big head. It's called the large-headed grasshopper. It is increasing lately, but mainly in pastures. Okay, what do grasshoppers do? The female backs the abdomen into the ground and lays eggs. This is a close-up of some eggs. They're all glued together with a biological glue that's much like bubbled styrofoam. If you look at this ground, all of those long peanut-shaped things you see are grasshopper egg pods, and there's about 30 in each. So you can imagine what would happen there in the spring. There they are in the hand, like brown rice. These are grasshoppers that are ready to hatch. Paul Riegert and others like that spent many years putting together graphs and drawings so people could actually look at these and figure out when they will hatch. I've done that with thousands and thousands of grasshoppers for other reasons. These are some examples of what they look like. These are Melanopus, and they're ready to hatch. If you take a close look, you can see the back legs inside that egg. The front 4 legs, all 6 legs on an insect, of course, are attached to the thorax. The mouth is flattened here, antennae are lined up, ready to go, compound eye. That one's ready to hatch. Now let's come back to this other species that's so important right now, the clear-winged grasshopper. It has big blotches on the wings. When they first hatch, they're black and white. Strange looking insect. You wonder what grasshopper is black and white. It's the clear-winged. They congregate. That's another feature of the clear-winged. They look rather angular a little later and kind of chocolate brown. So if these are in a canola field, no problem. They probably won't eat it. But if they're in wheat and barley, they certainly will. They feed on grass and cereal. Now, here's an interesting thing about the clear-winged. Every year for many decades, I've done parasite surveys. I don't get to Manitoba much, a couple of years, I'm sorry. I wish I did, but mostly Alberta, a little bit in Saskatchewan. I collect different species and I determine how they're parasitized. 24 roughly clearwing grasshoppers produced all these maggots. These things are really working for us in our favor once the population increases. But in the first year or two of increase, the fly can't catch up. These are flies that actually attack them. So if you see grasshoppers flying late in the season, glistening in the sun, quite likely the clearwing grasshopper. And it's worth looking for egg laying. So here they are lined up, adult clearwing grasshoppers on the left. And I put this in here to show you life's not fair. They have two stripes, but it's not a two-striped grasshopper. It's the clearwing grasshopper. If you look at the throat underneath the chin, there will be no spur because two-striped grasshoppers are in the spur-throated family. These are the smaller ones. A lot of sorting. Now, everybody knows about degree days. Temperature rises over the day and in some kind of a peaking fashion, then settles down. And the integrated temperature, the integrated degree days under that is an indicator of how much heat, usable heat, that could be used by a plant or a cold-blooded animal like an insect. And people have used that as a rough approximation. It's not great, but it tells some interesting stories. In the 90s, I used to throw degree day maps on the web every week so people could tell what instars the grasshoppers were in. And it's quite typical that they would peak in Alberta and southern Saskatchewan before in Manitoba. This is a funny looking graph, but I just thought I'd throw it in to show that if you do use degree days, you pretty well have to compute it, every day or every few days because things change. I made this for my students. I computed the degree days day by day for a couple dozen cities. 2018 was a terrible spring. Very cold, very cold. Nothing happened. Gardeners were going crazy. And then suddenly in late May, it got hot and it caught up and surpassed the other years. So that does happen. And it's worth being aware of. However, if you use degree days, it's usually based on air temperature. That's not where the insects are. It's also ignoring species to species differences, timing, and so on. So that's why degree day models of a lot of insects like grasshoppers are out by a week or two at least. Others are better. So we made a model that's a little different. It has a fairly linear section, but then when it's a little bit too warm for them, it drops. And it has a Manitoba connection. I was external examiner on a PhD thesis from the University of Manitoba by Derek Lacton under Neil Holliday. And we all worked together to take an older model that I had, and Derek added a parameter to it. It's quite realistic, gives us improved modeling. We threw that on the web thinking a few grasshopper people would use it, but it's been used now in over 400 studies of other insects. So sometimes you do these things and you think, should I share it or not? I guess we did the right thing. So here's what egg hatching looks like for different species. Some of them have quite a steep growth rate as a function of temperature. Others, less steep. So this one, the clearwing grasshopper, really needs warm conditions in order to boost its way up to successful hatching. And that's why one of the reasons, the other reason is disease. Clearwing grasshopper thrives under hot, dry conditions. So there's the general model. It's not unusual. Rate, of course, is just 1 divided by how many days it takes to go through a stage or to hatch. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but blue, green, yellow, those are immature stages. The orange is the last immature and the red is adult. Obviously, here I'll go down here. This is the two-striped on the lower right. Obviously in June, we have mostly young. In July, they're tending towards the older, and then in late July, adults begin to show up, and that's when they have the wings. You can control them at any stage. It's often said, shoot for the third and fourth. That's true, but they all die from insecticide and many other methods as well. And this one is not a huge migratory pest. So timing is important, but it's not so important. What is important is not to control too early because they're still hatching. That kind of data, I only like this graph. This is from 25 years ago when I was first making models of this kind of thing. I only like it because of the colors. But it just shows you we can take an engineering approach, and that's what we do from one stage to the next, to the next, to the next. And we simulate age structure. So that's why when you go out in the summer, are they in the third stage? Are they in the fourth? No, they're pretty well in all of them, right? But they vary in the proportions, you know. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about non-pests. We have quite a few. We have about 100, but many of them are very rare. So I'll give you some examples. People see things like this and they think, oh my God, it's so big and ugly, it must be a pest. But of course it isn't. This is a non-pest species called the green fool, Acrolophytus hertypes. Beautiful grasshopper, well, beautiful in an ugly way. But this big keel on the back and a lot of other things about it indicate it's not a pest. I'll mention just for 30 seconds, they do have a positive side. Native grasshoppers like this one, but also pest species like the ones in this owl pellet feed native birds like owls and grouse. This is from coyote. Coyote has been feeding on two-stripe. Grassland songbirds are served by a large guild of completely non-pest species out on the grassland. So if you control grasshoppers around a pasture, you can often just do it on the edge, and you can often delay that if they're not actually moving out. It's okay to have a lot of grasshoppers in pasture and range if they're not the ones that attack crops. We rarely have overgrazing in Canada on rangeland like they do in Wyoming and Montana. And by the way, this little one is found wherever the grass gets a little fescue-y. It's called the Dawson's grasshopper, and grad student Cy Mayhoff recently proved that it's one of the most important food items for sharp-tailed grouse. Okay, I'll show you examples of overwintering species so that you could advise someone not to worry early in the season. This is an unusual grasshopper. It's in its fourth stage now with that little triangle bud at the end of the year. It overwinters as an active grasshopper and doesn't freeze to death. It's got cryoprotectants in the blood. This one's ready to overwinter. That's a photo of maybe October. If they have enough heat in the fall, or if they wait for the spring, they'll actually shed their skin, go to this last stage. Looks like it's built like a tank, but it's it's one of the red wing species. It doesn't matter which, but I'll show you what it looks like. Here's how tough it is. Sometimes they come out in March and walk across the snow to get to the grasses that they need. Here's what it looks like in the spring, and now you'll recognize it. Everybody's seen this. First thing in the spring, you've got these grasshoppers flying around, clicking away, red wings. Not a pest at all, important bird food. Never caused any economic impact. And they fly so fast, you need a net like that in order to really catch them. A little bit more on the diversity. Our pest species are called shorthorn grasshoppers because they have short antennae. All right. And hind femur enlarged. That's no big surprise to anyone who's seen a grasshopper, I guess. Now, what does it mean to be short-horned? Well, katydids are long-horned, and sometimes they increase in large numbers, and that, of course, freaks people out. A great big green thing flying around the place is disturbing, but not a pest ever. Never in history have they been a problem. Even our Mormon crickets are not pests like they are pests in parts of the USA. You can hear a lot of noise, singing and so on. And whenever they're singing, it's not a pest. These are tree crickets. You hear these singing quite shrill in the late summer. Bizarre. I'd love to, but I won't get into it too much. But the male finds a nice sounding board in a leaf if he can, lifts his wings, sings, attracts a female. She feeds from the special pit on his back to attract him. She lies on his back. While she's doing so, he passes a tiny round spermatophore to her, which then fertilizes her later. Very strange, these things. Okay, the ones that are pest species can be told apart by their signature genitalia at the back. For example, this spatula-shaped organ here indicates Packard's grasshopper. This one shaped like a winter mitten indicates migratory grasshopper. So if a person wanted to use a hand lens and become an expert, it doesn't take long. I should probably run a workshop. How much time do I have, Tammy?
You still have lots. Don't worry.
Okay, good. Now here's the problem. Thanks to the confusion sown by evolution, some of these things look alike, except they differ in size and a few other features. But we have a secret weapon in the genitalia here. This on the left is the migratory grasshopper, very serious pest. This on the right is the little spur-throated grasshopper, which is probably the most common grasshopper in the prairies. But we never see it because it's very small and it stays to range. It wouldn't feed on weed if you forced it to. But it's small and it's colored the same, so you pretty well have to have them side by side. However, on the back here, those cerci that I mentioned a minute ago when I was talking about shape are just like an antler. So any grasshopper with a tiny antler on the back is a rangeland species of no consequence to agriculture. This is sort of a typical species distribution, and I threw it in here. I identified all these one day, actually took a few days, up at Cold Lake. I threw it in to show you what it typically looks like. A lot of rare species, and then a couple that are pests, kind of in the middle, and then usually a dominant one. And this one, strangely enough, has become dominant in the northern zones. And I suspect central Manitoba probably has them growing as well. Here's a take-home message. If a little bit of this is new to you, the spur-throated grasshoppers that contain the two-stripe, the Packard, the migratory, the Brunners, and so on are silent. So if people say I can hear them out there, the answer is don't worry about it. The band-winged, which include the many colored band-wings, but also the pest species Clearwinged and Carolina, which I'll come to, can crackle when they fly. But fortunately, whoever set this up is a genius. The two pest species in that subfamily are silent. So anything crackling, not a pest. Finally, the last group we have, slant-faced, they scritch away in the grass and they sing and they sound like a little bird or something sometimes, but they just make a scritching sound, a scratching sound. Absolutely not a pest, none of them. So really, if people say they can hear them, that's not the problem. There's the spur on the throat. It looks like an Adam's apple, except that it's an arthropod. See that bump sticking out? It's so obvious. So if someone brings you a grasshopper, first thing to do is look for the bump. Here's what I mean by colored wings. That's the colored wing on the one I just showed you, that spring species that has a red wing. Here's a spring species with a yellow wing. Here's one with a bright blue inside femur. Those are all non-pest species, but they feed burrowing owls, which is what that hole is. Here's an oddball. This is another bandwing that's increasing in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and has been for some time, but doesn't seem to be causing any problems whatsoever. It has a light yellow wing. It's called the Western Clouded Grasshopper, and they really do build up. It's blotchy back wing like that, and blue, bright blue tibia. Unfortunately, to make it difficult, it can even be green, and it can be brown. But I threw this photo in because I was impressed that that female laid that entire egg pod. They really kick out a lot of eggs. So it seems to me that this one has the numerical potential to become a pest, but apparently doesn't have the dietary preference. And there's a lot of species like that. So it's wrong to say the non-pests are the ones that don't reproduce much. No, sometimes they do. Okay, here's the other
And
one.
just a 10-minute warning, 10
Okay,
minutes.
thank you. That's good. I need that. Here's the other one that's an issue, potential issue in Manitoba right now. You're seeing a lot more of these Carolina grasshoppers flying around. And I don't know, I suppose I should do a poll or survey, but I'm pretty sure you do. It looks like that when it flies. Now, do you recognize it? It flies like a butterfly. Flies back and forth, swings this way, swings that way. And there's supposedly an evolutionary reason for that, by the way. When birds see a butterfly, many species of grassland birds don't chase it. They know they can't catch it. So a grasshopper that flies like a butterfly maybe fools some of those birds. So it's kind of an adaptation. But a light, very light yellow band on a black wing, big grasshopper. And it has some natural enemies. These two maggots came out of this one right in front of me and killed it. And it's killed by fungus. This is a Carolina grasshopper that's been infected by the fungus Entomophaga grilli, which then spreads to other fungi. Okay, I don't want to imply that the non-pests are completely neutral. Sometimes they are actually slightly helping us, although I don't think it's ever been quantified how much. This, believe it or not, is a grasshopper that only eats Russian thistle and certain other weeds. Yes, Tammy, we should do a collaborative study. I've seen fields where the two-striped and the migratory and the clear-winged are just thick. And when they walk away, the only thing left is thousands and thousands of kochia plants. But this one, if we could somehow get it to work for us, could go in and eat them down. Okay, here's another one that's banded, colorful, three-banded grasshopper out on the rangeland, not a pest. There's many of those. I don't have time to show them all, but the really striking grasshoppers are usually not pest species. As a female doing the kicking off the male thing, they're very picky about sex, grasshoppers are. Okay, this is an important one for Manitoba for an unusual reason. This is called the greenish white grasshopper, which is kind of a nice name, I guess. In the US, they have a name that's a little more ominous. It's called the cudweed sagewort grasshopper. But anyway, it feeds on Artemisia ludoviciana. So wherever you find that, you have a chance of finding this, but it declined for about a decade. And yet the one place it didn't decline too much was southern Manitoba. Very interesting. You go down between Brandon and the US border and you can find it. But now it's spread back. And in the last few, not spread, but increased again. And I think because the food plant's doing extremely well. I couldn't believe how big they were this summer. So if you see a little tiny greenish white grasshopper, you can correctly say that is the greenish white grasshopper. It's the official name. It always sounds like you're making it up. Okay, this is an important one for the spring birds, and it's gigantic, and it freaks people out when they see it flying. I went on a campaign in the 80s to get people to stop spraying these because they would appear and they would look so huge and so early that I would see it even in the newspaper, get the sprayer out early. And I was very pleased one day when I met up with the pasture manager, and he didn't know who I was. We were just chatting, and he told me the big bumpy ones that fly and have yellow, orange, or red wings are not pests. I heard it on the radio, and I thought that is just great. Anyway, so this is Xanthopus corylipes, and it can be yellow, orange, it can be red. Lays eggs that unfortunately look like the two-striped grasshopper eggs, but they're darker. Now, a little bit about natural enemies. I'll go quickly through this. Crickets, spiders, ants, blister beetles, bee flies, the maggots of bee flies, that is, rubber flies, various wasps, ground beetles. They all kill grasshoppers, but not very many. But after the grasshopper's been around for a couple of years, so that you can get a numerical response of the predators to the populations of the prey, they do actually take a fair bit. There's some years in which they probably knock them down by a quarter. And then some that don't do much, but they interfere with their performance. These are red mites on a Brunners. Those are very common lately. Mild reduction in ability of the grasshopper. They don't maybe fly or breed as much. This is a grasshopper killed by Entomophaga grilli. They cling to plants. If you see them clinging, here's the two-stripe killed by it. Here's the Carolina killed by it. And these are the Clearwing killed by it. That is a naturally occurring agent that will actually kill quite a few. I mean, 5 or 10% can be knocked down, and it's a bit of suppression. And one year, or at least one, maybe more, it wiped out an outbreak. In the early 60s, it killed an outbreak of the clear-winged spores all over the ground, they claim. This is what they look like. It has a resting spore. I was able, after a lot of fooling around with temperature and light and other environmental features, to get them to germinate, spray them, and they do kill some, but not enough to really make a pest control product. This is a Canidia-4 on a Carolina grasshopper. Maggot coming out of a grasshopper.
Down to about 5 minutes.
Okay, there's the fly. I'm trying to get a little diversity in here. There's the fly that comes from the pupa, that comes from the maggot, that comes from the grasshopper. So these are really quite effective in some years, 5%, 10%. But clear-winged, wow. Some years they're knocked down by 3/4. Amazing. Okay, a little bit on spiders. Everyone sees these and they're afraid of them for some reason. I think because of the size. The banded garden spider, they eat a lot of grasshoppers, and they're all across the prairies. Problem is, they're not here every year. They're here now, last year and next year. They're on a peak. That's what they look like. Tell everybody they're not a problem. If anyone tells you that they saw a brown recluse, there's a way to tell if they did or not. They didn't. They're not here in Canada. Okay, there's a wolf spider. It's eating a velvet striped grasshopper early in the spring. Unfortunately, a non-pest species, but they do eat a lot of pests as well. Robber fly catching a grasshopper. Now, I thought I'd talk, John and others asked me, would you mention biocontrol? This fungus metarhizium is probably the one that works best that we could actually use as a product. My grad student, I shouldn't say my grad student, but I was supervisor, but she did the work, developed a PCR method for screening these fungi and telling them apart. I said, let's apply it to soil across Alberta. And we did, and we discovered 4 or 5 new isolates that kill insects, and one was quite effective. This is what it does on a grasshopper if it's sprayed at fairly low concentrations, like 1 million spores per mil, say. It depends on how you set it up, but we put typically 50 grams of spores per hectare. That is pretty light treatment. Here's how they kill over time. This is in the lab. Ours is the one with squares compared to a world strain. The world strain killed faster for some reason in the lab. Ours killed within about 10 days. These are field collected grasshoppers from the prairies. Kills within about 7 or 8 days. There's a dose response, much like there is with everything else in the efficacy world, including coronavirus, by the way. For this one, it's actually similar to the virus by chance, about 1,000 spores per unit. Not effective, but higher rates are. Okay, that's how we produce it on barley. And then I tumble it in a cement mixer. I connected a $100 vacuum to a cement mixer, and I got a beautiful product from it. So it's very simple to do. We don't have a manufacturer we gave up looking for years, but it typically kills about 60 to 70% in the field when it's sprayed. Here's a trial we did with lentils. Large number of grasshoppers at the beginning, a 50 gram and a light 25 gram, both killed, not as well as lorazepam, of course. But a month later, it was still holding them down, and lorazepam was slowly coming back. So it has potential. Research sampling is done with a ring. Control management sampling is not required. You just look to see, how many you have per square meter. Typically, the lure, although it varies a great deal, is 10 to 12 per square meter is more or less of a threshold. little take-home message, GIS was for insect management was basically invented first in Canada on the prairies. We in 87, 88, we used very, very, very rudimentary PCs back then to map the grasshoppers, and then came up with a color scheme that's stuck for many of them ever since. We keep track of our data, and I hope it's actually somewhere kept track of in Manitoba as well over time. I've got a 50-year database now, and we compare that to things like management actions and climate to see if we can discern some changes going on. Am I out of time now?
Yeah, pretty close.
Okay, I just said I'd mention that we looked back over time and found that, you know, just from weather data, we do have a slightly longer growing season, and that will, if that continues, that will cause grasshoppers to come out just a little earlier and have a little bit more success. And if that happens year by year, it could compound into a future that's not free from grasshoppers. So that's my talk.
Thank you, Dan.
You bet.
I have a really quick question before we move into the next thing.
Should I stop the share?
Oh, up to you.
Okay.
The question that I have is, one, can you give us all a photography lesson someday? Photography. And then from a biocontrol perspective, how do we get any traction? For instance, someone suggested a cricket breeding program, but you maybe suggest that isn't the right way to go, but you have a biocontrol option out there. How do we get something like that moving forward, considering I do work for a company that may have marketed Lorsban for a number of years already?
Yeah, I've worked on probably a dozen microbes and then maybe a larger number of species that are, say, in the arthropod or other invertebrate world. And of course, worked on predators a lot too. None of those things really have potential for control agents, except maybe a couple of the microbes. And even those are more suppression. I think that the metarhizium has more potential than anything else for visible suppression, you know, detectable, statistically discernible suppression and reduction. You can typically get a 50% reduction in a couple of weeks. It's not what many people need, though, in a cereal field, for example. And I think that the bottom line on biological control agents is that instead of maybe, you know, breeding them and releasing them and all that sort of thing, maybe we should just stop killing them. Because if we knew a little bit more about how their cycles occurred and what drove them, and if we were aware of their timing and their species diversity, we could work with them a little bit more without really taking a loss and encourage natural enemies to help us that way. I think there's more to be gained from detailed knowledge of natural enemies and avoiding interfering with them, just getting out of the way, basically. Yes
or no? Should we be worried about locust outbreaks?
We don't have any locusts, but
so no.
but
okay, the places we're just really tight on time. Sorry.
The places that do have them should be worried.
Okay.
Africa has a resurgence.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we do need to switch over to the poster session and the coffee break because there are people that need to go to there. So thank you very much, Dan. I know that I find you on Twitter, so I'm sure others can find you there as well. So thank you so much.